Hello, today I'm going to be talking about Canadian judicial powers, specifically judicial review in the context of the Notwithstanding Clause. So, the Notwithstanding Clause was designed as sort of an emergency tool, but recent political uses, specifically in Quebec, Ontario, and Saskatchewan, which are where the case studies I'm kind of pulling from show it is being normalized as sort of a shortcut to avoid judicial scrutiny, which is a shift that's really signaling a weakening of political norms around rights protection, which is something that we should be aware of and we should be concerned with. And unless these norms are sort of reinforced, I would say the clause's continued use will start to undermine kind of the legitimacy of the Canadian Charter as a whole. So, beginning with some background information, the Notwithstanding Clause was designed as an emergency tool that prevents courts from striking down charter violations contained in instances such as those referencing fundamental freedoms, legal rights, equality rights, etc., things of that sort. And the clause is also referred to as Section 33 of the Charter, and so I will be using those terms interchangeably throughout this presentation. But anyways, the Notwithstanding Clause overrides, they last up to 5 years and can't override democratic rights, mobility rights, or language rights. So some of these things are kind of, I guess, written into stone. So there are limits to provincial powers in this sense, but the major fear here is the preemptive use of the Notwithstanding Clause, which is being done, and it is something that I think we should be looking at and we should be worried about, because that's not what it's intended to do. And because we're straying from the original intent, we're also straying from kind of what this solution provided, because the Notwithstanding Clause was used as kind of a political compromise between the provinces when the charter was being formed in the first place, because provinces were afraid of the courts having too much power, and so this was used as a solution to that. But now, because we're not using it how it was originally meant to be used, there's fear over provincial government having too much power compared to the courts. So the roles have kind of flipped in that way, which I think is really interesting, and maybe it can maybe help highlight some flaws in how the original Notwithstanding Clause was even framed or written, which I'm not going to talk about in this presentation, but I think that's kind of interesting. Anyways, so the original intent of the Notwithstanding Clause was meant to be used as sort of a safety net in instances where maybe the courts were not upholding rights protections in the way that the provincial government saw as fit. But the shift from kind of how we're using it as more of a routine political tool is really calling into question how politically costly this is, because it was not meant to be used as often as it is. It was meant to be like a very last minute, like if all else fails, kind of like a last minute big weapon of sorts. So it was meant to be politically costly to those who were using it. But now there are concerns over kind of how governments are being held accountable and whether they even are being held accountable by the people anymore, because it's not as costly anymore to enact Section 33 of the Charter because it's being done so often. And I think this is a really important thing to think about, because if our political power, in the form of how we're holding politicians and our government accountable, if our political power is diminishing, then kind of the whole balance of the federation is at risk of being thrown off. And I think it's really important that we look at these early warning signs. Yeah. I have some examples of the use of Section 33 in recent years, specifically from Quebec, Ontario, and Saskatchewan, as mentioned previously. In Quebec, Section 33 was used preemptively, which means that it was used before the courts even ruled a decision in 2019 against Bill 21. Bill 21 was put in place to ban public employees from wearing religious symbols of any kind and targeted equality and freedom of religious protections. In this instance, the courts found some parts of the bill to be discriminatory. I mean, it sounds pretty discriminatory just saying it out loud, but unfortunately they had their hands tied because of the use of Section 33. Why does this matter? This matters to us because it sets a precedent for using the notwithstanding clause as an insulation of sort from judicial oversight instead of as a response to it, which was the original intended use. And the more we look at it, when things start to stray from where they're doing, our control over it, our grip around it, begins to loosen. And that's not a good position to be in. Not a good position to be in. And also it really calls into question the whole idea of accountability. There's also another instance in Quebec with the use of Section 33 with a law which would essentially expand French language requirements in education, business, and immigration. Quebec invoked Section 33 almost immediately to shield against equality and legal rights challenges. And again, this matters to us because the notwithstanding clause kind of became, in this instance, a tool or a built-in feature, almost a built-in feature of this legislation rather than kind of a tool used, in exception, which was how it was supposed to be. And it's kind of changing how laws and bills are being passed and reviewed by setting this precedent that the notwithstanding clause is something that can be evoked as frequently as it currently is. Another example I have is from Ontario, where the provincial government threatened to use Section 33 when the courts ruled against a wage capping law. This law, Bill 124, was also kind of reviewed in 2019, and it's no longer in place. But this instance really shows the government willing to use Section 33 to suppress this idea of collective bargaining, which is protected by the Charter. Yeah. The final example that I have is from Saskatchewan, where the provincial government invoked Section 33 after a judge issued an injunction against a policy requiring parental consent for pronoun changes at school. This example is one where judicial review was just bypassed completely before the beginning steps of legal analysis could even think of unfolding. And so it's just going to show how quick provincial governments are to use the notwithstanding clause. It's like skipping steps in our democratic processes that we Canadians are so proud of, and it's definitely a loss, or it's starting to catch up to us a little bit. So it's something that we need to consider for the future. Speaking of the future, what exactly does all of this mean for the future? So I have three kind of premonitions, three kind of visions for what this means. First of all, this signals a weakening of political norms. Governments traditionally avoided Section 33 because voters disliked the overriding of rights, but now it's used so casually that it's sparking a shift in how we perceived political norms. But now, because it's used so casually, the political norm that, politicians and governments are supposed to serve the people and do what the people kind of, what's in the best interest of the people, that no longer exists or is no longer as strong. And it kind of hints at political cost, as I was discussing before, are decreasing, and that governments aren't being held accountable by the people as easily anymore. And that's a scary position to be in. We're not at a place where this is reaching extremes yet, but it always starts somewhere. So it's just something to think about. So second of all, the preemptive use of Section 33 kind of flips the original purpose of the notwithstanding clause, because it was originally meant to be kind of a response to the court's rulings and whatever bills or laws that they were reviewing at the time. Now, provincial governments sort of build this idea of the notwithstanding clause into the legislation that they're working with, and use it to bypass and avoid the judicial review entirely, just because it is an extra step for them to deal with. And it really, just that entire process undermines the accountability mechanism of the charter, which was ironically why the notwithstanding clause was put forth in the first place. And finally, the future will most likely begin to involve more political instead of strictly legal battles, just because legislators are having more influence in kind of the judicial processes than they were originally meant to, and a lot of what is going to control or restrict the use of the notwithstanding clause is not going to come from the courts themselves, because they do not have the power to kind of veto whatever decisions the provincial governments are making with Section 33. Instead, it's going to be coming from kind of public opinion. I talked a lot about why this is bad. My argument kind of focuses on the negative part of the notwithstanding clause being used as frequently. I talked about how the normalization of the overrides weakens rights protections, and what comes with this is that minority groups are more vulnerable, and the preemptive use really prevents courts from actually doing their job, which is clarifying what XYZ law violates. But I guess there are some good parts of it, some positives to it that I think is only fair to mention in this presentation. And so the ideas that I kind of listed off were that democratically elected legislators should have a final say on balancing rights, and kind of on with the same idea, courts are unelected and sometimes make decisions that aren't in the best interest of the people. And so it's important that we have that this option, the notwithstanding clause, kind of what it was meant for in the first place, to make sure that laws are in the best interests of the people. I hope that after looking at the examples and what the future might look like if we continue on this path, I've kind of proved my argument that, the shift between what the notwithstanding clause was originally meant to do and how we are going about it now, that shift really shows a weakening of political norms around rights protections, and that it is something that we need to keep an eye out. Thank you.